we've been wondering now for over a week, is diplomacy going to work? When is an actual set of demands going to be put forward so that we can try to figure out if Ukraine will take them or if the war is likely to continue? Well, we've got those demands now. So the breaking news of the morning, Moscow is demanding that Ukraine cease military action, which again, in the midst of an invasion that you did is, as I believe Aaron Ryan said, it's the stop hitting yourself of international diplomacy, but whatever, that's what they're calling for. Change its constitution to enshrine neutrality. So to be clear, what that means is rejecting any aims to enter any bloc, particularly, of course, NATO. Acknowledge Crimea as Russian territory and recognize the separatist republics of Donetsk and Lugansk as independent states. There's no immediate reaction from the Ukrainian side, but those are the demands that have now been put forward, Francesca. What do you make of them? They pretty much line up with what you expected?
I mean, to be honest, they're a little bit less extreme than some of the regime change language that Putin was going off about even just a few days ago. So who knows? I mean, I don't even know if I can trust those who are acting on behalf of Putin. His closest advisors seem to not understand what he actually wants, and of course, everything is coming from him on down. So if that is it, which let's get to the fact that it's way too much. Interesting, don't really believe that that's it. Still kind of believe after 3 assassination attempts, they're gonna try and depose and get rid of and topple Zelensky. I think that's what they ultimately want. But also Zelensky had a really interesting point early on. He's talking about Donetsk and Luhansk, or I'm pronouncing them both wrong, but like he was like, I grew up there. Like I know my friend, he's like calling them my name. He goes there, his family's there, this and that, and talking about, this is not just giving up a piece of your territory, like, yeah, whatever, it's fine, it's pretty much Russia. No, this is Ukrainian land. These are Ukrainians. Now, look, if there at some point is a referendum, right, where it's a democratic decision, where the people of those provinces and regions decide that they want to be independent, that's a different question. I'm not saying I know what's in their heart, but it is, you can't just claim a territory because there are a lot of Russians there. Sorry.
Exactly. Yeah, and by the way, just briefly, I'm glad that you touched on that. So the fact that these territories should be naturally absorbed into Russia because there are cultural, connections or whatever. The argument that Putin was right to go in to denazify Ukraine. It is not that there is nothing to any of this. The idea that there are some Nazis or neo-Nazi groups that obviously misinformation demands some element. But we fight misinformation from the right constantly. We will also do it from people who might ostensibly masquerade as on the left. I want you to take every one of these arguments and consider whether you would accept it if the US government was making it to justify an invasion that they were doing. And if you wouldn't, and I don't think you would, you should not accept it from Russia either. Oppose imperial invasions, even if some people that you kind of like and agree with are trying to make the case that it makes sense. In any event, most of these seem in line with what I would expect. Absorbing more territory, finally erasing as even a potential topic of debate the status of Crimea seems pretty much expected. Them not getting into NATO, ceasing the military action. I am wondering what are the bounds of that? Is that ceasing the ongoing military action, or is that no ongoing relationship with NATO countries, the US, to strengthen their military after this invasion? And by the way, while there is currently no explicit provision for regime change in the demands that are being largely talked about today, in the lead up to it, and maybe this is what you were referring to, Francesca, there had been whispers that they are going to allow Zelensky to technically stay on as president, but that Yuri Boyko would be made the PM. Now, obviously, you and I, Ukrainian politics experts, were well familiar with Boyko. But anyway, no, he is considered to be, in terms of nationally known politicians, one who often talks about having closer ties to Russia. So that isn't currently on the table, but if it is, that's sort of what we've been expecting, that effectively government power would be shifted over to someone who wants to gradually increase the ties with Russia. And when you combine that with all the rest of this might be an appealing deal to a country that is being decimated daily, but it's a rough one too. I think there's some particularly bitter pills to swallow in that.
Yeah, I guess just 2 points. Look, Ukraine wasn't gonna join NATO. NATO knew that, Ukraine knew that, and Russia knew that. And they decided to invade anyway. So the whole idea of NATO, Ukraine not joining NATO, you've only made the argument and the case for Ukraine joining NATO by attacking Ukraine, right? So that doesn't make any sense. Again, I don't believe that Putin is an honest actor in any of this. Agreed. Secondly, let's say they make this deal to stop the violence right now. There is absolutely, and I'm sure Ukrainians understand this better than anyone, there is no guarantee that this is all that Putin wants. There's no guarantee that in 2 more years or 3 more years or 5 more years when the country's starting to rebuild, that they will not attack and go for more and more and more. The people of Ukraine have voted out the pro-Kremlin leaders that they've had. They've risen up in popular uprisings against those leaders. Zelensky is a product of the idea. And I think Zelensky is doing a pretty good job of walking a line between, extolling NATO and the EU and also being sensitive and understanding that there are people who do identify culturally maybe with Russia. And again, I don't know all kinds of the histories, but like it's the people of Ukraine aren't like, they weren't necessarily rushing to join the EU or NATO, right? But Putin has tipped the scales against in that direction. At this point, I'd be like, hell yeah, I want to join the EU, So again, I wouldn't take any of this seriously, but hell, whatever you need to do to stop the bullets from flying. That being said, as I think we're gonna talk about, at what point has Russia ever stopped the bullets for people to even evacuate? Every single ceasefire for emergency evacuation has been blown past.
Exactly. So let's move into that. We have a couple more updates I want to make sure that you know about. One is that the humanitarian corridors have apparently not been respected remotely at this point. Ceasefires, the areas that are supposed to be free from violence have not been. Zelensky has rightly denounced. It is completely immoral to be targeting people in these areas. In any event, Russia then announced they would be setting up additional ones specifically that would allow people to flee only to Russia and Belarus. So doesn't seem like the most serious offer right there. But the US has apparently, the US and NATO have in 1 week given 17,000 anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. So that is obviously a massive help in fighting against the invasion. Also, look at what the US is capable of doing when it wants to. That's a big effort in a week. Zelensky is of course asking for it. By the way, Washington is helping with intelligence as well, putting together really fast updates of Russian military troop movements. You have to wonder at some point, really what the distinction is between some of what's being done and moves that we know would trigger a war with Russia. Like if you give them all of this stuff, it seems like a bit of a philosophical distinction between that and you aiming it and pulling the trigger yourself at a certain point. But apparently this is the way these things are run. So there's other potential deals to transfer MiG-29s out of Poland to Ukraine in exchange for us giving F-16s to Poland that are currently supposed to be given to Taiwan. Poland says no at this point, partially because they're worried about being targeted by Russia as a result of it. So there's a lot ongoing. Very briefly, Francesca, what do you make of these other updates?
No, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think it's the amount of money that we're throwing at this is insane. And that being said, I am glad that we are trying to exercise a certain amount of restraint. I said this the other night, but look, the difference between whether this attack happened under Bush, under a Republican, let's say it was Bush, or let's say it was Trump, is night and day. If it was Bush, we'd already be in World War III. If it was Trump, there would be no sanctions and Ukrainians would be completely left alone. We wouldn't sell them any weapons. We'd sell them like a few things. We'd be like, I don't know. And then we'd put it on other NATO countries to give them weapons. And we would essentially help Russia in their efforts to topple the regime. So that's the only thing I can compare it to. And we shall see, but is incredibly volatile and scary.
For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/thedamagereport. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.